Hi, my name is Aaron Krogh. I'm a student in the vision program here at NIU. I'm studying to be an orientation and mobility specialist and a teacher for students who are visually impaired. The title of my study, The Use of 2D Tactile Graphics to Represent 3D Objects. So a tactile graphic is an image that's been processed in such a way that it has raised and depressed surfaces and or differing textures so a person can feel the image rather than seeing or looking at the image. So the inspiration for this study came for me when a presenter came to one of our classes from the American Printing House, which I'll talk about later. There was a kind of a debate between him and Dr. Kapperman, who is a professor emeritus in the vision program here at NIU. Both the presenter and Dr. Kapperman are legally blind. The presenter claimed to have firsthand experience of people being able to gain information from tactile graphics, which are essentially two-dimensional, um, but be able to gain an understanding of three-dimensional objects or three-dimensional information from those tactile graphics. Whereas Dr. Kapperman and Dr. Kelly, who is an active professor in the vision program, both think that it's absolutely useless to try to represent 3D objects with tactile graphics, which are essentially two-dimensional. So the whole debate just really sparked my interest about whether there's any way that three-dimensional information could be encoded for the sense of touch, but encoded in two dimensions, or if a person could be trained to learn how to read two-dimensional tactile images in a way that it would give a three-dimensional understanding. However, the basic argument, especially from Dr. Kapperman and Dr. Kelly's perspective, I think, is that just outlining with raised lines the outline of a 3D object doesn't give a person that doesn't have functional vision any practical understanding of that object. So that's where this study picks up, just kind of at the basic level of the argument that I was privy to. So the Journal for Visual Impairment and Blindness is kind of the central repository for research in the vision professions. It's kind of the main journal. So I did a manual search and just looked through every article from the years 2008 to 2018. And I did find 25 articles that all related to tactile representations, tactile graphics, um, includes tactile maps and models, and also tactile symbols. And I didn't pay much attention to the articles or studies that had to do with tactile symbols. Um, these could be symbols like a fork, which would represent lunchtime for a student, or a circle, which might represent circle time, or a band-aid, which might represent going to the nurse's office. So there's symbolic representations, and the student doesn't need to be able to have a sense of the object itself when looking at the tactile symbol. It's more just what it means. It's a form of literacy, I guess. So I put those articles aside. In the literature review, I did find what I expected to find, which is that while there are studies relating to tactile graphics and tactile representations, uh, all the studies were either looking at two-dimensional tactile graphics and their use for giving an understanding of two-dimensional realities or two-dimensional concepts or two-dimensional objects, or the studies, if they were using 3D models, uh, they were using the models for three-dimensional concepts. And there was absolutely no study that addressed the use of two-dimensional tactile graphics to represent three-dimensional objects. So it shows that it is an unexamined practice in the field. So the American Printing House is one of the top manufacturers and distributors of educational materials for students that are blind or visually impaired. The government gives $300 per student per year for each student that's receiving vision services to use to get materials from the American Printing House. So as such, they represent in a way the state of the field and the thinking of the field. And if you go to their website, they do have many products that use raised line drawings and outlines of various three-dimensional objects, but in specific to the study of animals. So I think this shows that it is actually a common practice across the country. So it's the purpose of the study to test whether this practice is effective or not. And as I mentioned before, anecdotal evidence that I've heard from people who are blind suggests that it isn't useful to have outline, raised line images of animals or anything three-dimensional. It just doesn't impart any useful information. But as I had shown in my literature review, it just hasn't been studied. So to put a specific research question to this query would be, does the use of 3D models result in the identification of 3D objects more frequently than the use of raised line drawings? So the age group that I would like this sort of study to work with would be pre-K to first grade. I didn't do this in my literature review, but I think it would be interesting to review the literature and see how and when the experience of perspective develops in sighted children, to have some sort of comparison. So for the study, I think the subject should be congenitally blind, which is often defined as a person not having any visual memory to draw on. I think that provides kind of a blank slate to make sure that when examining tactile graphics, the student isn't referencing past visual experience. For the setting, I would envision that while working, my subject, I'm going to name Sharon. So while Sharon's working with 3D models and raised line drawings, I would envision that she would be working in a quiet classroom with just herself, the researcher, and her TVI. And then in my education, my experience here at NIU so far, I've heard it recommended multiple times that if students are going to be going on a field trip, that you can call up beforehand and say, hey, we have a student who's blind or visually impaired. Could you set up something more hands-on? So this kind of gave me the image of going to a natural history museum as a way for Sharon to get her hands on actual animals, to test the efficacy of raised line drawings versus models of animals. I also really like the idea of a place being built called Crustacean Hall Natural History Museum. So if someone built it, I will definitely go. Sharon has three 20-minute sessions a week with her TVI. So I would envision that within 2 weeks, Sharon would have 3 sessions where she would be able to work with, depending on which phase she was in, work with the raised line images of animals or with the 3D models of animals. I was a little bit conflicted on the number of animals to include. I think that it shouldn't be too many, so that it's not an exercise in memory, but it should be enough that there's a wide variety of animals and also that there's enough data points. So when I was looking at different available images of animals, I just thought it settled on 8 as a middle of the road option. After Sharon's gone through 3 of these 20-minute sessions with either the raised line images or the 3D models, the qualifier that would show that the treatment had actually been implemented would be that she was able to feel the model or the raised line drawing and be able to identify it as the correct animal. So to test both the baseline treatment and the intervention, the culminating experience will be for Sharon to sit down with the TBI and the researcher and a naturalist at the Natural History Museum and to explore taxidermies of animals. She'll be presented with both animals that she had explored through the use of raised line drawings and models, and also others that she hadn't been exposed to. In both phases, she'll be prompted to identify the animals. However, in the first phase, after working with raised line drawings, she won't be given any leading language, and she won't be given confirmation on whether she's correctly identified the animal or not, so that her tactual knowledge of the taxidermy doesn't transfer to the next session or to the next phase. However, in the next phase, or the second session, the naturalists will be free to discuss the animals in more detail so that Sharon doesn't miss out on the information and the experiences that her classmates had during the field trip. But the naturalist can only discuss that after Sharon has correctly or incorrectly identified an animal. So for instructional materials, the APH, the American Printing House, discovered they have a free online tactile graphic library. So you can download images there, and if you have the correct printing materials, you can print out raised line drawings. So for this study, they'll be printed out on swell paper. Downloading images from this library, I think, has the benefit that it's free, that it's readily accessible if you have the right materials to print out the images, and it will also allow for the set of raised line images to be standardized in case the study was to be reproduced. So I started with the animals that were available on the tactile graphic library, and I kind of picked the set of animals from there. And then I was exploring the internet looking for producer plastic toys that would have each of the animals that were selected for the tactile graphics, but I couldn't find any specific producer that created each and every one of the animals. So I don't have a source or a standardized source for plastic animal toys to serve as 3D models, and that's a limitation of the study. This study would envision using a natural history museum as a place to access taxidermies of animals. However, I list that also nature centers, zoos, petting zoos, aquariums, and or pet stores would all be other places where a student could get their hands on actual animals if this study were to be reproduced. So the tasks of learning raised line drawings and 3D models were chosen because these are standard ways of presenting information that a person who's blind or visually impaired will be dealing with and using throughout their educational career and throughout their life. Animals specifically were chosen as they're often used in early educational materials. Animals also provide a wide range of tactile experience. And the use of animals fits in well with common field trips that kids experience, going to zoos, going to museums, nature centers, and etc. Basic AB design was chosen for this study. It's not the strongest design. However, once the student examines 3D models and identifies the animals through the 3D models, that knowledge can't be taken back. So doing a true AB design wouldn't be feasible. I'm also expecting that if the study were to be conducted, there'd be a pretty stark contrast between the use of raised line drawings and 3D models. So I think to an extent that would boost the significance of the study or the findings of the study. To whoever is listening to this missive, um, any ideas on different designs that would fit this study would be of interest to me. Also, yeah, if you're going to implement an ABAB design, that would necessitate 4 trips to a place with taxidermies, a nature center, natural history museum, instead of just 2 trips. And so just the practicality of an AB versus an ABAB design was part of the decision to go with an AB design. So the independent variable is the use of 3D models of animals or plastic toys of animals to be able to actually identify those animals, or in this case, taxidermies of those animals. The dependent measure is the subject's ability to tactually identify actual animals after having examined raised line images of those animals and after having examined 3D models of those animals. So as Sharon is examining the taxidermies, both the TVI and the researcher will be observing, and 1 point will be given for correct identification of the animal. However, no point will be taken away for misidentification of the animal. In addition, whether or not Sharon correctly identifies the animal, she'll be given a half point. If she identifies parts or aspects of the animal, such as, oh, that's the tail, or this animal has 4 legs, this animal has 8 legs, this is the animal's ear, any of those observations will be given a half point in addition to either identifying the animal correctly or not. When we're doing visual analysis, it seemed like a lot of treatments were temporal, time-based in the sense that they were progressive. So the graphs we were looking at were showing a progression of the dependent variable in regards to the independent variable. In this case, there isn't a temporal aspect, I don't think. It's just in each case, when examining in a taxidermy, actually does Sharon identify it or not? Um, and I don't think there's a progressive cumulative aspect to the treatment. However, I think a similar type of graph could be used. So the x-axis, on the x-axis, there'll be a marking for each of the animals that she had uh, explored through the use of raised line images and 3D models. The y-axis will be where the number of points she gets for identifying the animal or aspects of the animal will be recorded. Both the TVI and the researcher will be present at, for all the sessions of the study. And so at the museum, when Sharon is examining taxidermies, there'll be two people to observe and take data. A discussion between the researcher and the TVI will take place on what constitutes a correct identification of an animal, and a document will be created listing these qualifications. And I think that would be valid to include with the publication of the study. So I think the basic social validity of this study is that it looks at an unexamined and widespread practice in the field that may not be effective. As such, I think it's worth examining. And then I say blind and visually impaired students have a reputation for being pleasers, being able to verbally parrot back information and feign understanding. As such, ineffective tactile graphics may not be questioned or flagged by students. And this isn't from my personal experience, but I've just heard it over and over from professors in the program and also from presenters that we've had come speak to our program. And then in addition to that, a student with visual impairments, if they're presented with a tactile graphic and they don't have any other information surrounding that, they may just take it at face value and not know that they're missing out on something. So that may be another reason that ineffectual tactile graphics aren't questioned by students. Finally, I think it would be a benefit to the study that the student would be interviewed on their experiences with both the use of raised line drawings and 3D models, so that a narrative evaluation of the experience could be included with the raw and interpreted data. So in summary, I feel like the idea that 3 dimensions can be represented in 2 dimensions often goes unexamined by sighted individuals, as this does hold true for the visual sense. The visual sense accommodates an understanding of perspective. However, this may not hold true for the sense of touch, and that's basically what this study is trying to examine. In my literature review, as I went from the year 2008 to the year 2018, more and more the idea of 3D printing came up in the studies. And so while this study may be interesting, it may also be a moot point, as 3D printers become more accessible, cheaper, and more efficient and quick in what they do. Another thing that I noticed in my literature review was that often a limitation of the study that I was looking at that was noted was that because the field is so small and that visual impairment is such a low incidence disability, that the studies are seldom repeated. And compounding this is that people who are blind or visually impaired are largely a heterogeneous group. So if you're looking at these studies that have small sample sizes, it's not obvious that the results can generalize across the whole group of people who are visually impaired or blind. So those limitations would affect this study too, but it would be nice if this study and all the studies that I looked at in the literature review were able to be reproduced, and if there's ways they could be reproduced with a wide sampling of people who are visually impaired or blind. So I came across the work of these two people that I list here in my literature review. The specific study that I was looking at that they published in the Journal for Visual Impairment and Blindness was looking at teaching a person who was blind how to draw images like these after examining a 3D model of a cube. They found that the student was successful to a certain extent, but it took a lot of time and effort. And what the student learned didn't necessarily generalize to. However, I am interested in looking into further studies that these two people have done. It looks like they really go into the psychology of experiencing perspective through the sensation of touch. I didn't explore their studies for my literature review for this particular study because I feel like it was more psychological, whereas what I was trying to look at is more functional and day-to-day and prosaic. They may have some interesting insights, but I don't think they're applicable to the everyday practices that I was looking at in this study. To end with, I included this image as an example to hopefully somewhat make real what I'm looking at in this study. So if you visually examine these images of cubes, it's evident the three-dimensionality and perspective of what's being represented. However, at least to me, if I was to imagine all those black lines being just raised lines on a sheet of paper, I can feel my fingers running over it, and the only thing that I would see would be very surface level and at face value. I think all I would feel would be shapes of diamonds that were conjoined. So I hope that gives a real experience of what I was looking at in this study, and thanks for listening.